Has your brain ever wondered what the parts of the brain are and what are their functions? Well, that's basically what we're going to talk about in this video. So what you're looking at is a section of your brain. And to make sense of this, let's say you could see someone's brain from the top. Then you would be able to see the two hemispheres like this. Don't worry, this is not a brain, this is just a walnut. It looks very similar to the brain. But let's say these are two hemispheres. Now, imagine you cut this walnut, and then you look at the inside side of this one. Then you would see something like this, right? The inner side of one of the halves. Well, that's basically what we're looking at. It's the inner side of one of the hemispheres, okay? So let's get rid of that and look at the different parts. We can broadly divide our brain into three parts. The forebrain, which is this big yellow section. The midbrain, which is this tiny pink section. And the hindbrain, or the lower brain, which is this blue section. Usually when we say humans have big brain, we're basically talking about this forebrain section, okay? And then the midbrain is actually the beginning part of the brain stem. Brain stem is on top of which the forebrain sits. The brain stem connects the forebrain to the spinal cord. This continues as the spinal cord. So the beginning section of that brain stem is what we call as the midbrain. And then the later section of the brain stem is a part of the hindbrain, right? This is the hindbrain. And the hindbrain also consists of this section. You know, this itself looks like a mini brain all by itself, but that and the remaining portion of that brain stem is basically what we call the hindbrain. Okay, so what are the functions of them? Before we get into the details, to get a broad sense of what these parts do, we can think that the forebrain is responsible for all the voluntary functions, and the midbrain and the hindbrain together are responsible for all the involuntary functions. So when I say voluntary, think about all the actions that you carry out consciously by thinking about them, like to take a walk, or maybe to talk to someone, or decide to watch this video about brains. So all of that is from your forebrain. And of course, we'll talk more details about that in a second. And when I say involuntary functions, there are some functions that are happening in your body which are not in control, which you're not in control of. For example, your heart beating, or maybe your digestion. You're not in control of those, right? So those are mostly taken care by your midbrain and the hindbrain. So how do we remember which part does which? Well, the way I like to think about it is I remember that, what makes humans special is their big brain, big forebrain. And I remember that we have this amazing intellectual ability, right? Our intelligence. So forebrain gives us our intelligence. So it's because of that I can do all my thinking and all my decisions, and also I can walk and talk because of this. So that's how I basically remember forebrain controls voluntary actions. With this in mind, let's look at the functions and the parts in a little bit more detail. So let's zoom out a little bit, and I've made some space so that we can write more parts. So let's start with the forebrain. If you look at the forebrain, you can again kind of see two sections of it. The outer section, which contains a lot of folds, and the inner section. Let me shade that inner section a little bit darker so we can identify that. So the outer section, right, this big giant outer section, it's called the cerebrum. The cerebrum. This whole outer section, which I have colored with light yellow, is the cerebrum. And we're not going to look at further parts of that, okay? So that's the outer section for us. If you look at the inner section, we're going to look at three parts of the inner section, okay? One part, which is over here. So let me put an arrow mark like this. Then one part, which is a little below that, which I'm going to write over here somewhere. Okay, wait a second. Yeah, let me write that over here. And this small thing that you can see, that one. These are the three parts that we need to remember, at least for our syllabus, okay? So this one, you know what we call that? That is called the thalamus. Let me use this color, okay. It's called the thalamus. And these are all Greek names, okay? So it will not make sense to us. But I looked up thalamus kind of means an inner portion or inner region. And that's basically what this is, right? It's the inner region of our forebrain. So the part that comes below that is called hypothalamus. So the next part is hypothalamus. And hypo kind of means lower, so it's the lower part of the thalamus, hypothalamus. And this last part, which we'll be interested in, this one, this small thing that you can see over here, that is called the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland. Right, this part over here, okay? So these are the 4 parts of our forebrain. So these are the only parts that we'll concentrate on. So let me just put them together. So this is your forebrain parts. All right, so what do they do? What are their functions? We don't have to look at the individual functions. We don't have to do that. But the forebrain as a whole, what does it do? Well, one of the things, like we already said, voluntary functions, but again, let's dig a little deeper. What does it do? Well, one of the things that you can think of is thinking, right? And when I say thinking, I'm including a lot of things over here because there's not much space. Thinking, your learning ability, your speech, language, all of that comes from your forebrain. But what else? To think about what else your forebrain can do, take a look at this picture. The reason you are able to see this is because of your forebrain. You may be wondering, wait, it's my eyes, right? It's eyes. But the eyes send the signal to the brain, and it's your forebrain that does the processing, and that's why you can see it. Similarly, you can hear me right now because of your forebrain. All the 5 senses, you can sense them because of your forebrain. And so one important function of your forebrain is sensing. Let me just write that as sensing. Okay, what else? Well, you identified this picture, right? It's a puppy. Did you confuse it with something like maybe a donkey or tiger? No. The reason you can even remember it's a puppy is because of your memory, because you know what puppies look like and you can associate with it. So that also comes from your forebrain. Memory, learning, all of that comes from your forebrain. Now, when you looked at this puppy, some kind of emotion came in, right? Like you may have felt, oh, what a cute puppy. You may have felt happy looking at it. Maybe if I showed you some different picture, maybe if I showed you some scary picture, you would experience fear, right? So all the emotions, they too come from your forebrain. All your emotions, including love. That's right, love does not come from the heart, it comes from your forebrain. In fact, fun story, the other day my wife asked me, hey, how much do you love me? I said, I love you with all my forebrain. Yeah, she hasn't spoken to me since, but it was worth it. All right, now besides these, there are also other things that the forebrain does. Some of the feelings that you get, like for example, the feeling of hunger, the feeling of being sleepy, thirst, or maybe, after you have finished a meal, the feeling of fullness. All of that also comes from your forebrain. Actually, that comes from this part of the forebrain, but we don't have to remember all those things. So these are some of the functions of your forebrain. So what's next? We're not going to look at the parts of the midbrain. It's a tiny section. We'll not look at its parts. So let's jump directly to the hindbrain. If you look at this brain stem over here, the bluer section, you can actually see 2 distinct regions over there. So one region, one lump over here, and one more here, right? So this one, let me use a different color. Right, so this one over here, it's called pons. That's the name given to it, pons. Again, I know, little weird name. It's Latin, again, it means bridge. It's kind of like bridging between the middle brain and this bottom part. That brings us to this bottom part, which is pretty important for us. The bottom one is called, let me write that down right here. It's called medulla oblongata. Okay, we're gonna look at its functions separately. And then you can look at this big region. Let's make it dark so we can see that. So this region, which kind of looks like a brain on its own, is called cerebellum. Do not confuse that with cerebrum. Cerebrum is the biggest part of our brain. cerebellum. That's the name given to this. So these three regions are going to be the part of our hindbrain. So these are hindbrain. And since we're not going to look at the parts of the midbrain, this is it. This is all the parts that we need to remember. So again, what are the functions of the hindbrain? We already saw it's involuntary, but let's look at the individual one. Let's look at medulla oblongata and the cerebellum. These two are important for us. So what does the medulla oblongata do? Well, again, it controls most of the life-giving involuntary processes. Okay, so we'll say life-giving involuntary processes. I'll just write involve, okay? Involuntary processes. That means these are the most essential for life, like your heart beating, your breathing, digestion, all of those essential things are taken care by your medulla oblongata. Along with that, it also controls some of your reflexes. Now, if you've studied about reflexes before, you may be wondering, hey, isn't that controlled by your spinal cord? Yes, some of them are controlled by the spinal cord, but some of the reflexes, like your sneezing, coughing, those are controlled by your medulla oblongata, all right? The idea is the reflexes are not controlled by your thinking part of the brain. None of the reflexes are controlled by the forebrain. That's why they're even called reflexes. But the medulla does control some of your reflexes as well. So these are the two major functions of the medulla. Okay, what about the cerebellum? It's getting a little crowded. I hope you can see them apart. So again, I'm going to put some division over here. Anyways, so what does cerebellum do? Well, cerebellum also has some involuntary functions, but it's a little different. One of its function is to maintain balance. Balance. Now, what I mean by this is, if you want to do even the simplest of the simplest tasks, like walking or maybe holding a cup, these things requires careful calculation, coordination. You have to think about where the gravity is and all of those stuff, right? If you try to build a robot, it's then you actually see how complicated those things are. But we do it with ease. That's because of our cerebellum, because it is the one that maintains balance. And along with that, another major function is motor memory. Motor memory. What's that? Well, think of riding a bicycle. With the first time when you were trying to learn the bicycle, you were using a lot of your forebrain. You were learning. You were learning to get balance. You were learning how the pedal works. You were learning maybe how to do the tring and everything. All those things you're learning. But once you learned that, once you've done enough practice, now when you want to ride your bicycle, you don't even think about it. We say it has become our second nature, right? All of things happen automatically. How? It's the cerebellum. That's what we call as motor memory. Another example could be, let's say when you're typing on a keyboard, if you have enough practice, you don't have to look down anymore. You don't have to worry about which keys are where. It just automatically happens. Motor memory. So all those things are controlled by the cerebellum. And you know how I can remember this? I remember this by remembering that, when people drink alcohol, it's their cerebellum that gets affected. Think about it. If your cerebellum gets affected, your balance gets affected. And that's why people who are intoxicated, they can't balance themselves. They will be walking funny and everything. They may no longer be in a position to ride a bicycle. This is actually one of the reasons why we say don't drink and drive, because your motor memory gets affected. So even the most basic things that usually we think it's easy for us to do, like while driving, that gets affected. All right, so that's how I remember the functions of the cerebellum. All right, so finally you may be wondering, what about the midbrain? So this is our midbrain, right? We're not gonna look at the parts of the midbrain. Midbrain also controls some of the involuntary functions. For example, when you shine light in your eyes, your pupils become smaller. That is controlled by your midbrain. So the midbrain also controls some of your involuntary functions, but we're not gonna look at that. And this is pretty much it for us. Now, since this screen itself contains the entire summary, why don't you try pausing the video and then revise and then see if you can recall all the parts and the functions without looking.